Hello and welcome to Students on the Move, a podcast about the benefits, obstacles, and opportunities of international students in higher education. International migration for higher education is a global phenomenon, an industry worth billions of dollars. But what does it mean from the perspective of the students themselves, as well as the host countries and the receiving universities? Today, we're joined by three guest speakers with extensive international experience. Together, they offer a unique view of the challenges and opportunities presented by students on the move. Kirk is an American who went to Thailand as an international student and stayed. He currently works for an NGO focused on ethnic minority and migrant children. Kirk will be looking at international migration for higher education from the perspective of Asian students. Huda is a Black American Muslim with 10 years of teaching experience. 8 of those years were in Qatar, where she taught in international schools. Huda is currently wrapping up a master's in international education with a certificate in bilingual dual language. She plans to return to Qatar, where she hopes to use her knowledge to advocate for culturally appropriate English education, with a focus on the linguistic rights of home languages. Isaac is a Ghanaian with 10 years experience as a teacher in Ghana before moving to Japan as an international student. He currently works as an ESL teacher in a public school in Japan. He is also currently enrolled in the Masters in International Education program. Isaac will be discussing the perspective of the institution and its role in the entire process of international migration for education. So Huda, how many students are on the move globally? And specifically, what are those numbers in the United States?
Hi, and thanks for having us on. But before we start looking at the numbers, I think it's important to define what is an international student. And according to UNESCO, an internationally mobile student is an individual who has physically crossed an international border between two countries with the objective to participate in educational activities in a destination country, where the destination country is different from his or her country of origin. Now, with that in mind, according to UNESCO, in 2019, there were over 6 million international students participating in this global knowledge arena. And more than half of these students were enrolled in just 6 countries. The United States of America ranking number 1 as a top receiving country, followed by the United Kingdom, China, Canada, Australia, France, Russia, and then Germany. And the number 1 sending country worldwide and to the US is China, followed by India, Germany, South Korea, Vietnam, France, the US, Nigeria, and then Saudi Arabia. And we also see what Joan Dassin and Aaron Baxter have mentioned in a 2017 Fresh Ed podcast as old colonial patterns, determining where a lot of international students go, a sort of backtracking of colonial footsteps. Now, when we look at the U.S., according to a report published by the Institute of International Education, in 2021, this past academic year saw around 914,000 students from abroad enrolled in U.S. higher education institutions. While this number is high, it has actually gone down 15% from the previous year, so around 160,000 less international students, which translates into a loss of around $10 billion, according to NPR. Now, you may be wondering why this decline in international student enrollment. So, in 2015-2016, we passed the 1 million threshold, and it had been a consistent growth for over a decade. And then in 2016, Trump was elected, and that growth started to slow down. Other key factors of this decline were the rising costs of U.S. higher education, high numbers of student visa delays and denials, and overall just a very difficult political environment for immigrants under the Trump administration. And then the COVID-19 pandemic was the icing on the cake. Something else that we should mention is that while all these red flags were popping up for international students, why they should not come to the U.S., expanded opportunities to study in other countries were popping up elsewhere. All this to say we're in the 4th year of decline due to travel bans, executive orders, and xenophobic and racist rhetoric. And of course, COVID-19.
Okay, wow. What can you tell us about the economic impact of this massive industry?
Thanks to neoliberalism and globalization, knowledge has been successfully turned into a market good, a commodity roughly worth 85.43 billion US dollars this year alone. And that's projected to be worth 169.72 billion by 2028. In the US, the 914,000 international students that we mentioned earlier make up 4.6% of the total US student population, contributing 39 billion to the US economy in 2020. Now remember, this is actually down from the 45 billion they contributed to the US the previous year, according to the US Department of Commerce. So this year was the first year that the dollar amount dropped since they began calculating more than 20 years ago. Now, there are some who may argue that international students are not bringing in money because of scholarships and grants. However, 83% of undergrad students and 53% of grad students are funding their U.S. education from their personal income and their family. So, on top of all of that, for every 7 or 8 international students that comes to the US for education, there are 3 US jobs that are created. Now, consider that when international student enrollment dropped last year, jobs declined by 9.2%, which equates to 42,294 positions. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, that's a lot of people out of work. Therefore, we need to keep this in mind that not only do international students create jobs, but the decline of international student enrollment means a decline in jobs, a decline in livelihood for Americans. We need to bear this in mind when discussions are taking place and policies are being made concerning international students in higher education in the US. So, I've been talking about the statistics and the money from the macro perspective. Now, let's hear from my colleagues who will look at the meso and the micro to give a more personal perspective.
So, Isaac, do the large numbers of international students negatively impact domestic enrollment? What I'm asking is, do they take up seats in universities and colleges that would normally be filled with American citizens?
Thank you for the question. Part of the racist and xenophobic rhetoric surrounding international students is much like the rhetoric surrounding immigration, that immigrants are stealing our jobs and displacing Americans. Similarly, some argue or claim that international students are taking up seats that domestic Americans would have otherwise. Well, in fact, this is actually not true. According to an article by Kevin Shee, which was published in 2017, Kevin had done the study from 1995 to 2005, which established the fact that international students did not crowd out domestic student enrollment in higher education, but actually crowd in. So what this means is that international students pay 2 to 3 times more than domestic students pay for higher education. That is, international students are paying the full sticker price for tuition. In these schools, international students allow for cross-subsidization. The higher tuition they pay allows for more domestic students to enroll. This is especially true at state universities.
So, Kirk, tell us about an Asian student perspective on international migration for higher education.
Well, I think it's important to look at the wider context. Globalism and capitalism do produce losers, but in Asia, they've also produced a lot of winners. In the past 20 years, many low-income countries here have become middle or upper middle income countries, and this has impacted education. From English classes for preschools on through a massive private tutorial or cram school industry aimed at teens, something which Will Brehm, the host of Fresh Ed, actually touches on in his book about Cambodia. But this rise of prosperity and the growth of budget airlines have really contributed to Asian students doing a lot more international travel and international study throughout Asia, and usually in English. Now, you can get a sense of this if you look at UNESCO's interactive map on international student flows. For example, China, by far the world's largest exporter of international students, sends over 10,000 students to Thailand, or currently 11,800 according to UNESCO. Next semester, 90% of my students in a linguistics class I teach at a Thai university will be Chinese. Many other Chinese students studying Thai in a Chinese university first for 2 years, and then they transfer to a Thai university where the medium of instruction is Thai. So they're developing very strong Thai language and cultural skills. And if these students graduate and get a job with a Thai company or school, the Chinese government will actually supplement their income, essentially doubling the salary they get. They're essentially paying them to stay in Thailand and develop connections. So it's not only Western countries that use international education as a form of soft power. Of course, China also is quite generous in giving scholarships to African nations in which they have strong business interests.
So, are Asian students no longer interested in studying in the West?
Not at all. A Western degree is still the dream, and this has contributed to the cram school industry I mentioned. Again, China sends hundreds of thousands of students to the West, but due to massive cheating schemes, they can't take the SAT or ACT in China. So the cram schools have become travel agents, flying their students to other countries to take the tests. So here in Thailand, as a parent, I have to register my kids for the SAT or ACT literally the day the websites start accepting applications. Otherwise, all the seats will be taken by Chinese students. I was actually a little slow this year, so my son will have to take the ACT in Singapore. So these Chinese teens arrive at the test sites in tour buses, in matching t-shirts, caps, and backpacks, with all their documents neatly arranged by the cram school. And sometimes the Thai, or more likely Filipino, test proctors do indeed find kids whose faces don't seem to match their IDs, and that delays the test for everyone. There are also multiple businesses to help students with their college applications. Of course, this is also fertile ground for cheating. A few years ago, the Ivy Leagues got so frustrated with fake applications that several stopped even looking at applications from Thailand. Until a verification system that put a strong burden on high schools could be put in place.
So, after going through all of that, what is the Asian international student experience like?
Well, I think it's a mixed bag. The counselors at my kids' school, for example, have a great feel for how different US, UK, and Australian universities care for international students, and they advise students and parents accordingly. But students do have a choice on how much they choose to engage. I followed two Thai young men, friends of my son, as they went through college in the UK. They both agreed that the Thai student community in London was so large and helpful that there was no need to seek out native English friends. And in fact, the Thai kids complained that UK universities admit too many South Asian and African international students. So sadly, racism and shadeism is not just an American thing. And while their Thai parents hoped that they would make Western friends, they actually felt that Thai friends who they made while studying abroad could be more important for the long term for future business connections and so forth. So while Asian students are happy to talk about the difficulties of studying abroad, I have yet to meet any who say they regretted that decision.
Are there any issues of race that come up within universities?
That's a good question and a tricky one to answer with time constraints in mind. Racial discrimination and xenophobia within universities and racism among international students has been an age-long issue that society must contend with. Unfortunately, the answer to your question is going to be a yes because these ugly staff have found their way into our centers of academic excellence. A recently published article by Changamaya Mwangi and Mososen discussed how international students are positioned in a dichotomy of us and them, although foreign students are also lauded for contributing positively to research and innovation. It is interesting to note how faculty and staff contributed to racial harassment of students with their comments and actions, which might be out of genuine concerns, but it depends on what the one at the receiving end feels about it. So racism actually is not a very simple issue to be taken lightly by the institutions. I think that institutions must intensify their teaching on self-advocacy, mandatory training for college employees and professors, strengthen the rules and also strictly enforce them when such issues come up. But most importantly, organize activities and programs that help to enforce coexistence as well as showcase the importance of cultural diversity as our strongest bet for a peaceful academic life and experience. Vavrus and Pekol in a 2015 article stated that in 2012, the number one sending country was China with 235,000 students, while only 35,000 students are from the entire African continent. Kirk earlier on spoke in more detail about Chinese teaching schemes, yet we can't deny the obvious reluctance and interest in foreign students from the African continent. These distinctions between who can and cannot participate in an international study reflect long-standing inequalities in the global flow of capital driven by the global knowledge economy. And at the center of all these is the unmatched role of the institutions towards achieving one, a good learning space for proper academic work, and two, a vehicle for positive change for society at large.
Thank you, Huda, Isaac, and Kirk, for giving us your perspectives. And for our listening audience, please like and follow us on Spotify, Apple iTunes, or wherever you stream your podcasts. And be sure to join us next time when Students on the Move takes off for more exciting discussions.